Hola a todos, bienvenidos de vuelta al canal de la Red Cultural. Estamos con un invitado muy especial en un contexto muy particular. Son los 100 años de la Revolución Rusa y hoy nos acompaña uno de los historiadores más importantes del mundo en materia de rusa y soviética, Orlando Figes, un historiador británico. Welcome Orlando to Red Cultural channel. We are running in YouTube, but we are trying to build something huge to make closer the cultural and history to general people. So welcome to join us.
Thank you.
Well, this is the year of the 100th anniversary of the 1917 Russian Revolution. So everybody, all the world is looking at this event and are, I don't know, commemorating, some people celebrating, I know, some people regretting about the topic, but everybody is, they're talking about this event. Some historians says that it's the major event of the 20th century. How you see the 1917 event from as an event for the rest of the history of the world?
I would absolutely agree that it is the most important event of the 20th century. If you think about its consequences, direct and indirect, apart from the massive destruction and tragedy of the revolution itself, there is the small fact of the Cold War that it started off. There is the fact that probably, over a third of the world's population was living under regimes inspired by the 1917 revolution within a couple of generations. If you see, as I think many would, fascism and Nazism as a counter-revolution against 1917 and the influence of Bolshevism, then you could add that to the list of indirect consequences, which is, of course, means also the Second World War. So overall, I think the revolution determines many of the most important trajectories of revolution, war, civil war, Cold War, world conflict, and the geopolitics that we still live with today. And communism more generally, particularly in Russia, still has many legacies, particularly for the Russians in terms of the way they relate to power and think about civic duty, democracy themselves, and so on. So huge consequences. And so I think it's sort of, in a way, surprising. You say, the whole world's thinking about 1917. I'm not sure that's true. I don't think the whole world's thinking about it at all. They're not, certainly in Russia. I mean, in Russia, there's a slight confusion about what to make about the revolution. I think Western media is slightly confused about what to make of it too. There isn't, for anybody, apart from perhaps, the old communists still lurking in corners around the world who have a clear narrative of what 1917 was about.
Yeah, so you said that now the Russia is not commemorating probably because I think generally thinking you will expect it that the major event will be doing in Russia.
Exactly. I mean, Russia's known probably more for the revolution than for anything else. Communism has been its great product and export around the world. And so possibly you could think, 1917 was an opportunity for Russia, not just to make a big event out of that as a great turning point in history, for better or worse, but you might have hoped that for Russians themselves it would be a moment to reflect on their own history, the foundation of the Soviet state, which for better or worse is what they still live in the wreckage of now. And so an opportunity, to think about issues of revolution, legitimacy of power, think about Russia's possibility of becoming a democracy in 1917, whether that was a real possibility, whether it remains a possibility, what sort of use can be made of that history for Russia today. And as you say, nothing really of that nature is being done in Russia. The government is making it clear it wants nothing to do with any commemoration. So there'll be a few academic conferences. And that's because essentially the subject is too divisive. I was in Russia the other day and one can see one element of society which must have paid for this big poster to be put up, which I saw, which just said, Gasudaryu Namprasti, sovereign. It was a picture of Nicholas II, sovereign, Tsar, forgive us.
Forgive us, wow.
Forgive us for the revolution. So that's one wing. But then for the other wing, there'll be old communists marching towards Red Square, pictures of Lenin, no doubt pictures of Stalin being carried. So it's a very divisive issue still in Russia, and it would be very hard to bring about what if the government has been talking about anything, it's the need for national reconciliation. But I don't think it's going to be easy to have any national reconciliation over the revolution, for one very simple reason, and that is to have full reconciliation, each side has to understand the other, and you have to understand what happened. And I don't think the Russians are close to that.
Yeah, and you did a big book on Russian Revolution. Actually, some historians says that is the best book of the Russian Revolution, and I agree. I think it's gorgeous. But you entitle it "The Tragedy of the People."
A people's tragedy
Tragedy.
How does it go in Spanish? I don't know.
La tragedia de un pueblo.
Okay. So a people's tragedy. Yeah.
So why that title?
Well, I think it was a tragedy, not just in the sense that it ended badly, but in the sense that there were many opportunities for it to have taken a different path, and it didn't, for circumstantial reasons, for reasons to do with the stage of history Russia was at that time, for the limitations of the historical actors, the Tsar, Kerensky, Lenin himself to some extent. And also I called it a people's tragedy because actually what I was doing in that book was running through the public narrative the story of individual characters, small players in the revolution. So there's a general, there's a writer, there's a peasant, who all wanted to influence public events and move the revolution in one direction. But what they all have in common is that they all found the law of unintended consequences. That, thinking they were going to bring about A, actually they brought about or helped to bring about B, or B happened because they couldn't help that happening. And that was the sense of revolution I wanted to convey. Revolution as chaos, revolution as something no one can control. So it's like a thunderstorm or a natural catastrophe that has consequences you can't predict. And that sense of chaos, at the time that I wrote that book, which is now over 20 years ago, and was maybe a sort of new way of looking at the revolution, which previously historians had approached as a story with very clear sort of faces, actors, parties, ideologies, collective groups. And I wanted to sort of say, no, that's not how revolutions happen. Revolutions are chaotic moments when there are no laws of outcome anymore. Things happen accidentally. There's a sort of chaos. Some people can predict the way it goes better than others, but no one can really control it.
No, that's true. You think it's too soon to make a balance or a proper view with the distance of Russian Revolution, as already they see, for instance, the French Revolution, because on the 200 years of French Revolution, there came a lot of new history appearing.
Well, the thing about the French Revolution, there's the famous thing about the Chinese leader saying, "How do you think? Too early to tell," was his story, which is sort of such a cliche now. But and I don't think it's true. I think the thing about the French Revolution is that for all that turmoil of the Revolutionary Wars, the Napoleonic Wars, then the conflict in 19th century France between Bonapartism and the imperial tradition and the republican tradition, since sort of the late 1870s, beginning of 1880s, a clear republican sort of dominance or hegemony even in terms of political culture was established. So that by the time of the first centenary of the French Revolution in 1889, it can be claimed for the Third Republic. They build the Eiffel Tower for it, So it's like the Eiffel Tower symbolizes not just Paris's dominance in Europe with the World Fair of that year, but it symbolizes the Republican ideals of the Third Republic, which are tracing their lineage to the Enlightenment.
Yes.
So that, so they're also, the year before that, they were celebrating the centenary of Voltaire and Rousseau. So it's like the idea that the revolution is part of an Enlightenment tradition which is carried on in the 19th century by people like Victor Hugo and others. And so the revolution becomes part of a national narrative. Yeah? And so the Marseillaise, Marseillaise is an important part of that, still the French national anthem. Whereas for Russia, very difficult to do that. It would be very hard to do that from 1917. Yeah, there's elements of it there. They still have a form of the Soviet anthem, etc. But essentially, it's a moment of division and civil war. It's a moment of mass violence and for some legitimacy, for others illegitimacy. And there's no clear post-revolutionary sort of stabilization of values from which a perspective can be built that this is what the revolution meant. So for some it's a catastrophe because it meant the destruction of Russia. For others it was the beginning of a great civilization, the Soviet Union, with which they may still identify. So, there's, coming back to your question, that's why it's too early to have a clear meaning. Historians can debate about it, but there's no sort of national sense of what it was. There's certainly no consensus.
Two ideology in between?
Teleology.
No, ideology.
Oh, ideology.
Too much ideology behind some.
Too much ideology, but too much conflict. Too much. In a sense, the ideology. It's a failed ideology.
I know.
So it's not even as if they can say, well, it was a successful ideology and system which then sort of just faded and grew old, and we can stand by its achievements. Look what it did. It can't do that because the ideology is absolutely bankrupt and failed. And there's very little that one can say, well, look at its achievements. What could you say? Okay, Soviet science and technology. You could give that 8 out of 10. Yeah? So they put Gagarin up into space.
Yes.
And
First.
okay.
That's Sputnik.
So that's good. They won the war against Hitler.
Yeah.
Well, for the Russians, that's like 10 out of 10, right? That's a sacred cow.
Yes.
And it's a major achievement, and obviously the West owes a huge debt to it. But at the same time, the more we've looked at the war, the more we understand this war was fought in a way that no other country would have fought, with sacrificing millions of people unnecessarily.
Exactly.
So yes, the war, but it's a very, very bloody sort of achievement. And then what else can they salvage out of that ideology? The industries they built? No. I mean, the Gulag, which is the price they paid to build it.
Yes.
They destroyed a lot of their country. So, and that was the ideology. I mean, might not have been the original ideology, but it was the ideology as implemented. So it's very difficult to look back to that and say, well, yes, it was something we did, and at its time it was good. It's now faded, and is now maybe time to move on to a new ideology. It's a complete sort of wasteland of values and of like the smokestack industries they created. It's a wasteland now.
Yeah, but there are some people now that still in the ideology, and when they look back to Russian Revolution, they just see gorgeous things. For instance, I wonder, was Lenin that bad, because some people believe that Lenin was good and the bad guy was Stalin, of course.
Yeah.
But was Lenin that good? This is
Yeah.
a good question. Were the Bolsheviks, that's mean in majority in English, were they really the majority?
Well, they were the majority when they won the crucial vote at the Second Party Congress in London in 1903.
Yes.
And they then claimed the name, which was of a huge advantage for them. They weren't the majority of the country by any stretch of the imagination in 1917. And when the real test came with the election to the Constituent Assembly in November 1917, after the Bolshevik seizure of power, they only got 10% of the vote. I mean, the biggest party, the Socialist Revolutionaries, which was the main party, got only 24%. So it's, you know, there's no clear sort of, but certainly the Bolsheviks weren't a majority party, and they never really had the legitimacy that propaganda claimed for them. For many years they faced a lot of opposition. Many of their policies had to be forced through against real resistance, so particularly collectivization. And terror was part of the system of governance from the beginning, as some of the Bolsheviks like Kamenev and Zinoviev, who were opposed to the seizure of power in October 1917, warned Lenin, if you seize power, you won't have popular support, and therefore you'll have to rule by terror. And they were right in that sense. Terror became a part of the system from the very beginning. So, yeah, but as you say, some people, remarkably, I might say, many public school boys, i.e. private educated men in left-wing circles in the West, still have this sort of romantic attachment to. So a couple of books have appeared in Britain, one by China Mielville, another by Tariq Ali, both sort of, they know all the facts now as they are about the consequences of the Bolshevik Revolution, the millions killed, the destruction of the country, the failed policies. They know all of that. And yet they still think, but Lenin, October, i.e. the revolutionary potential of action.
Yeah,
like
and
that.
generally they will say that the revolution was made by the people, the majority. They wouldn't say that they didn't have the majority. And after that they will say, and they come the civil war, and this is why the terror comes.
Exactly.
The point is, comes the civil war, or they create the civil war?
Yeah, well, absolutely, and that's one of the great Western left-wing myths about October, and you often see it. You see it taught in schools a lot. The Bolsheviks are the legendary version goes, the Bolsheviks were at the head of a popular revolution in 1917 in the name of the Soviets or popular councils, seized power. Then the counter-revolutionaries and the white armies, backed by the Western powers, tried to unseat the Bolsheviks. And so the Bolsheviks had to fight back in a civil war, and emergency measures, extreme measures like terror were part of that. And all of that was done by Lenin, who was, you know, forced into a violence. His violence was justified by the need to defend the revolution. And so we can still attach a positive significance to the Lenin phase of the revolution, which was very different from Stalin's phase of the revolution, which was, you know, clearly a revolution from above. Millions died in collectivization and famine and the terror of the 1930s. So that's as if to say, for that version, there's still a legitimacy, there's still a popular potential in the first phase of the revolution. But as you said, that's, I mean, and this is my big gripe with that historiography. No, the Civil War didn't start because the counter-revolutionaries attacked the revolution, forcing the Bolsheviks to fight. Lenin started the revolution, and indeed he declared the beginning of civil war, not even in October, but before that, in July 1917, when they had a failed attempt at an insurrection. which was put down, and the right of the forces behind the provisional government of 1917 started calling for stronger military discipline, and Lenin, who was now under threat of arrest and being brought before the trial, said, no, it's not a question of the courts, it's a question of civil war. It's a question of who will prevail over whom. If we don't take power, then the military dictatorship of the right will take power. So he wanted civil war, and he knows that in launching the insurrection of 1917, he knows there will be civil war. Yes. And Kamenev and Zinoviev's warnings are therefore irrelevant to him. His attitude, like the attitude of Trotsky, is bring on civil war, because they saw civil war as merely the intensification, or if you like, militarization of the revolutionary struggle, of the class struggle, which they were trying to develop, because they didn't have a popular base.
No, they didn't.
But if you make civil war, you polarize society. It's us against them. We carry the revolutionary banner, the red flag, the red star on our caps. We stand for the revolution. Anyone who opposes us is a counter-revolutionary. They're being paid for by the capitalist powers, by the whites and so on. And it's not in October that the Bolsheviks consolidate their power base. No one gives them more than 2 weeks when they come to power. They're very weak. The civil service won't work for them. The banks will close their door, won't give them any money. It's not in October that the revolution is won. It's only then that it begins. It's through civil war, through the creation of a mass Red Army, through the creation of a big Soviet bureaucracy, through the creation of a planned economy with requisitioning of foodstuff. That is how Lenin creates a revolution. And that's precisely his inspiration around the world. Because what it says to third world countries, which don't have an organized labor movement, let alone, they don't even have industries, say. They don't have an organized labor, so they don't have the democratic base or the social base for an evolutionary movement leading towards socialism. What Lenin's model of revolution shows is, as long as you take state power, establish a dictatorship, you can then use the state and the power of the army, the power of the bureaucracy that you create to make a revolution.
Yeah.
And your social base becomes the army, the bureaucracy.
Yeah, so this is what, for instance, they follow that example in Venezuela, for example.
Yeah. I mean,
Chavez is that way.
Exactly. And that's what's important and new about the Leninist revolution for the 20th century and why it has such an influence. And I think still, that sort of paramilitary party organization, the use of terror, the use of a very disciplined vanguard, the use of civil war, like, in Syria, in ISIS-controlled areas. ISIS learned a lot from the Bolsheviks, in the sense that civil war helps your cause. Because for every civilian killed by the enemy, you get a new recruit.
Yeah, I think that lesson also Lenin take it from the Jacobins in France.
It's there.
If you think about Saint-Just words, when he said, we kill few, we need to renew the mankind through blood.
Yeah, well, that is the weird thing about the revolutionary mindset. And you're absolutely right, it comes from the Jacobins. And it feeds into the revolutionary underground with their own Jacobins and populists or neo-populists of the 19th century. One of the big influences on Lenin was a revolutionary called Sergei Nechayev, who was arguably one of the first revolutionary propagandists to come from the ordinary people. And he spent a lot of his life in prison and escaped from prison, but he wrote something called the Revolutionary Catechism, which became a big influence on Lenin about how you organize a party. And in that catechism, he says it would be justified for the revolution in overturning Tsarism to kill 1 million people. Because if Tsarism continues without a revolution, in time it will kill 2 million people.
So it's justified.
Ends justify the means. And that sort of thinking, that becomes part of the Bolshevik political culture. Actually, not just the Bolsheviks, it becomes part of the revolutionary political culture, that terror is justified in the people's struggle.
One of the things that people are focused on probably is the most romantic view and threat also of the revolution is the Romanov family. So the beautiful family, it's an icon, so all the people love it. The girls are gorgeous, the boys fantastic, they are lovely couples, so it's like a fairy tale. So, and then they were murdered in that place. Who ordered that?
We don't know really who ordered that. I mean, Trotsky says that Lenin ordered it. Of course, the people who carried out the murder were the Yekaterinburg Bolsheviks, headed by Yurovsky, who were a pretty hot-headed lot. They were capable of doing it without, no, actually maybe not. I'm doubtful about that, but they were certainly much more violent than any other of the Siberian Bolsheviks, including the Tobolsk Bolsheviks, who previously had been responsible for the security and guarding of the imperial family. But I don't think it would have been done without the order of Lenin, really. And I think why the order was given is because obviously Yekaterinburg at that time, July 1918, was getting pretty close to the front of the Civil War. And the white armies of Admiral Kolchak were approaching, and there were sort of rumors that there might be an attempt to to rescue the imperial family. Not that any of the white armies backed monarchism. I mean, that's an interesting point. Monarchism, I think, as an ideology, as a political movement, as a political cause, was dead by this point. None of the anti-Bolshevik armies or movements wanted anything to do with monarchism. They knew it was impossible to return Russia to monarchism. As Trotsky put it rather colourfully, Russia had vomited up monarchism so violently in February, March 1917 that there was no way anyone was going to get them to swallow it again. Yeah. And that's true, but nonetheless, people were concerned about the Tsar, and it was possible that the white armies would have tried to rescue them. But I think ultimately probably the reason why the decision to execute was taken is that they wanted probably to finish the, it wasn't high on their priorities, but there had been talk about having a revolutionary tribunal, a public trial or show trial of some sort. And of course, if you allow for a trial, then you allow for the possibility that they might be innocent.
Yes. Which
is impossible. They've got to be guilty.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and moreover, you can't really control what happens in a trial. I mean, as they know with Louis XVI.
It would be any possibility that Louis XVI or Marie Antoinette were innocent at the end?
No, but a trial can become very inconvenient.
Yes. Yeah, actually, Marie Antoinette one was really inconvenient.
Absolutely, and that's the last thing they need in the middle of a civil war. So I think they just took the view that Lenin took the view. I think that they just had to be executed. I don't think he had any qualms about that. I don't think. I think that he didn't have any qualms about killing the children. They just had to be got rid of. As Stalin was to put it, no person. Or no body, no problem. So
nobody, no problem.
So and in fairness, though it was a civil war, we now, as you say, have there's a lot. I mean, the number of times I've been asked to give interviews about programs about the Romanov family, I could spend my whole life retelling the story of the Romanov family. I'm sick to death of it, to be honest with you. But now we see it as this tragedy, this personal story, the poor daughters and all of this, and absolutely true.
Yes.
But at the time, I don't think people, it's true that the Soviet press did not release details of the murder of the family, only of the Tsar and Empress. Would there have been a big reaction if they had? I doubt it very much. The response to the murder of the Tsar in 1918 was minimal. There was civil war going on in the country. People had other concerns. The Tsar was ancient history.
After Lenin gets sick, Stalin became an important person, but Lenin doesn't wanted that. So how Stalin became at the end and changed, because he was already the secretary of the party, but the church wasn't that important. So he became the man in the church, and the church after him was the most important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he creeps up on everybody, and the problem is that everybody underestimates him because they say, Stalin, oh, he's nobody, he's just a functionary. But meanwhile, he's collecting a lot of offices, as you say. In 1922, Lenin makes him General Secretary of the party. He's head of the Commissariat of Nationality, so he has an important say on the question of the structure of the Soviet Union. He's the only member of the Org Bureau, which is like the party management, who's also in the Politburo, which is the party executive. And that combination is crucial, because through the Org Bureau, he'll know all the details of every party member, or can have access to the details of every important party boss. He's also the head of something called Rabkrin, which is the Peasant Workers Inspectorate, which is like an informing network. People saying, the boss of this factory is good, or the boss of this factory isn't good, morale is like this, but it's like the sort of ears and eyes of a police state. And so all of these sort of levers give him quite a lot of power in the party. People are underestimating him. By the time Lenin realizes that he's rude, too centralizing, too chauvinist, generally a bad thing, which he does in early 1923, late 1922, early 1923, it's too late. Because by that stage, Stalin, as General Secretary of the party, has control of his doctors. Lenin has had a stroke and is recuperating, but then has another stroke, and by the time he's not able to write by the time he makes those statements, particularly on his succession, where he dictates to secretaries, Stalin is too rude, he must go.
Yes.
Absolutely clear and emphatic order that Stalin has to be dismissed from all his party offices. By that time it's too late. And although that testament, as it became known, did circulate, the party leaders decided not to make anything of it. And so it got sort of repressed, read only to party delegates. And then, a number of other factors come into play. So Trotsky, who arguably was the leader who might well have replaced Lenin if he had more support in the party, didn't, and was sort of feared and disliked by others in the party, particularly Kamenev and Zinoviev, who sided with Stalin to keep Trotsky out, because they thought Stalin, he's nobody, Trotsky, he's the dangerous one. So they sided with Stalin against him. And then I think the crucial thing that sort of allows Stalin to emerge from this sort of collective leadership is that he has the support of a lot of rank and file party members, a lot of them he's appointed himself through his control of the Org Bureau. And then there's a new intake into the party after Lenin's death, the Lenin enrollment, where a lot of people are brought into the party who don't necessarily have much understanding of ideology. And that, by the 1925 Party Congress, means you have a party with district and provincial level party bosses who owe a lot of their allegiance to Stalin, who identify with Stalin's message, which is forward to communism, and who don't really have much sympathy for the more nuanced arguments of people like Kamenev, Zinoviev, Trotsky. And Stalin's way of talking was very simple, so they identify with him. And that power base he has enables him to use policy issues to destroy enemies. So, thank you very much. So in the crucial, he uses the alliance with Kamenev and Zinoviev to defeat Trotsky. But then, the crucial battle is over. policies to do with collectivization, the launching of
Yes.
collectivization, the launching of the first 5-year plan. And there, he uses the policy to defeat Bukharin by saying that his more moderate approach to collectivization and industrialization are counter-revolutionary.
Yeah.
So, again, methods of civil war.
Yeah, and then
Us
come
and them.
all the suspicion of Stalin of everybody, and the Great Purge in the 30s that kills pretty much all of them.
Well, indeed, a lot of the old Bolsheviks
Yeah.
who had ever sided with Kamenev, ever sided with Zinoviev, ever sided with Trotsky, they all are purged in the 1930s, and the last of them, really, the old Bolsheviks, are killed off in
The
1937.
great question is, who really killed Kirov?
Does it matter? Yeah, maybe. Does it matter? I don't know. I mean, it's we'll never know who killed Kirov. Was this popular Leningrad party boss. The important thing about Kirov is, I think, that he was seen as a more popular and also potentially more moderate leader than Stalin, whose policies of collectivization and industrialization in the first 5-year plan had been widely criticized, not officially, but by many party members. So there was something called the Ryutin platform, a manifesto written by a rightist, moderate party member supportive of Bukharin's position, which circulated saying that Stalin was anti-Leninist. His approach was destroying the party, destroying the revolution, and that circulated. Svetlana, no, not Svetlana, the Nadezhda, the Stalin's wife, who committed suicide on 7th November 1932, I think as an act of political protest against Stalin, had arguably read this manifesto and sympathized with its criticisms. So Stalin had a sort of general sense of, there's a lot of people against me questioning my policies, and looking towards Kirov as someone potentially that they might vote in as an alternative. And indeed, at the party congress of 1934, just before Kirov's murder, we never quite know what happened there, but at party congresses they vote for and against. Kirov had lots and lots and lots of votes for and 0 against. Stalin had a lot of votes for, but quite a lot against. But we don't know how many, because the papers all disappeared and the man who collected them somehow got killed off. So we don't know, but essentially, by that time, Stalin had a lot of motives to want to see Kirov killed.
Out.
And the way in which he was killed by Nikolaev, being somehow allowed to enter the Smolny, the Leningrad party offices in Leningrad, with a gun, without question, get right into the office of Kirov and kill him, and very odd, very odd.
Very suspicious.
It is, and certainly if Stalin didn't order the murder, which I think we'll never know, he certainly took advantage of it to then immediately increase the powers of the political police. He took charge of the judicial sort of investigation himself. He launches a purge in Leningrad, and then all the old Bolsheviks, Kamenev, Zinoviev, Bukharin, and others who were brought to the great show trials of 36, 37, are accused of conspiring to murder Kirov.
Yeah. So Stalin industrialized the Soviet Union at a high cost.
Very high.
And but there is a real schizophrenia in the things that they supposed to promote as a party and as an ideology, and the things he did, because he industrialized the Soviet Union in a base of a new sort of slavery.
Yeah, you could say that.
They are the one that supposed to defend the workers, supposed to fight against the struggle with the bourgeois and the capitalists that pay less for them, and they create a world through not paying at all to the people, and even kill many of them. So the idea of extermination for one side and the gulag for the other.
Yeah, I mean that begins to happen already in the Civil War. I mean, I think for me the origins of that mentality, the sort of gulag pattern of industrialization, where you turn the working class into a sort of almost, as you put it, slave labor force, but one that, you know, is kept on a minimum ration-based system as payment for their work, with lots of punishments for failure to meet outputs and all of that. I think the origins of that come from actually Trotsky as Commissar of Labour in 1919-20, when there's a for me significant semantic shift where they stop talking about рабочий class, the working class, which is like the idea of the workers as agency, and they start talking about рабочий сил, workforce, labour force, a raw material. Yeah, and that's the moment when they begin to mobilise mass labour armies for building projects. So, you know, what did they do with the 5 million strong Red Army when they'd won the Civil War? They don't send them home. They use bits of it to build bridges, roads, railways, and all the rest. So that's the beginning of this sort of use of conscript labour. So it comes deeper from that, not just Stalin. And of course, with the mass industrialization building projects of the first 5-year plan, yeah, they return to that sort of model of industrialization where you arrest people to get a workforce. And it's important to understand that gulag dimension of industrialization, because a lot of historians, and I think it's commonly perceived, this idea that, you know, the Soviet Union had faults, but it had this amazing achievement of industrialization. It became a great power, and then it had the tanks it needed to defeat Hitler. And the Gulag and all of that side of it was like a bad side effect, but it was a side effect.
Yes.
But I think that's fundamentally the wrong way to see it, because the Gulag, we don't know what proportion of the industrial economy was provided for by the Gulag. Some put it at 25% of the national income, but that's not the point. The point is that to industrialize, the Soviet Union needed fuel, it needed minerals, it needed gold and nickel and platinum, which it could use for industrial purposes and to gain capital from abroad, and it needed oil. And all of those things in the Soviet Union happened to be in areas way out in the northeast of Siberia, the north of the country, yeah? And no one's going to go there of their own will. I mean, believe me, I've been to some of these places. No, what you offer them 3 times the average wage, 5 times. They're not going to want to go and live in Norilsk or Kolyma, right? So basically, one has to understand the development of the Gulag system as a system of forced industrialization and colonization of the country. Mm-hmm. And that's how they rationalized it themselves. So, you know, that's a different perspective, I think, on industrialization, yeah.
Yeah, but Gulag was a really important part of it, was it?
It was absolutely essential to it, because, you know, I mean, just take platinum, for example. You need platinum to produce high-grade steel, right?
Yes.
And you need high-grade steel to build an army capable of defeating Hitler.
Yes.
So, you know, unless they had sent hundreds of thousands of convicts to Norilsk in the far north of the Urals, where 1/3 of the world's platinum is produced today, they wouldn't have been capable of defeating Hitler.
Yeah, that's true. Well, after Stalin, well, the Soviet Union continued and then failed. So 1991 was the end of this Soviet Union and this real socialism that's supposed to be so fantastic, and everybody saw what really was. And then Russia became in a chaos for a while, tried to reinvent themselves, and now we have a new Tsar.
It's, well, we have an authoritarian government in Russia. I think the main reason for that is that the 1990s were perceived by the majority, overwhelming majority of the population as a catastrophe, an economic catastrophe, the collapse of the economy, of their savings, because of the hyperinflation, the loss of jobs and security which the Soviet system had given them, the loss of pride in their country, the criminality and corruption that they saw all around them. And so it was really perceived as a catastrophe. And so many look back to the Soviet system with a certain degree of nostalgia and regret that it had so suddenly collapsed. They weren't ready, they didn't even have the time to make the transition to free, liberal democracy and capitalism. You know, I mean, a lot of, capitalism in 1993 meant, you were given a voucher to a former state factory. But privatizing state enterprises at a time of hyperinflation is really not a good idea.
No.
Because what are you going to do with this voucher when you can't feed yourself, when you don't have a job anymore? You're going to sell it as soon as you can. I saw vouchers being sold for a bottle of vodka, because people got depressed and alcoholism became rampant in those years. So generally, it was right. It was chaos, but that really discredited Western capitalism as people understood that, which was very primitively.
This sense of catastrophe is the one that explained that in Russia they didn't like Gorbachev because the West loved it.
The West loved Gorbachev because he ended the Cold War, and supposedly, solved a problem for the West.
Yes.
The Russians see Gorbachev as enemy, as the worst leader Russia's ever had, and I mean that.
Yes.
I mean worse than Stalin.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been in many schools interviewing kids about Stalin, and they say, but Stalin was really bad. Yeah, he's not, but much worse than that was Gorbachev, because he destroyed our country. And that's how he's seen in Russia. And so that, 1991, the collapse of the system was seen as a humiliation. But there's more to it than that explains the sort of nostalgia for the Soviet system, and therefore, if you like, the tendency to find in Putin a strong leader who gives them security. And that is that they also were confused at that time because the ideology had collapsed. Yes. Truths that they'd taken in good faith, the ideologies that they'd believed no longer had any currency whatsoever, and yet people knew nothing else. So if you were, say, 40 in 1991 or older, let's say if you were 30 in 1991, so I was 32, so anyone my age or older in 1991, which is like the vast majority of the population, they'd grown up in the Soviet Union, they'd been schooled in the Soviet Union, they believed what they'd been told, that the Soviet Union. So it was very difficult then to sort of say, okay, we must reject all this. If you compare that with, say, Eastern Europe, where Soviet power really was an occupation,
yes.
They had no one to blame. They couldn't see it as an occupation. They couldn't see it as an imposition of an alien system on them. It was the system they'd grown up with, their parents had made, their grandparents had made. So there was a real sort of crisis of identity in the 1990s. Many Russians felt, we can't become these Western I don't know how to do that. They didn't know. And unfortunately, a lot of the people who did make it were either criminal or had connections, or they were former party bosses, or just, a lot of the worst of the country came to the fore in the 1990s. So for all those reasons, Putin comes along and is seen as a figure of authority, sobriety, not like Yeltsin, who stands up for Russia, has brought back security.
Make Russia great again.
Make Russia great again, but that's important to a lot of people. This is, after all, always been an empire. So it's comforting for people to think we're great again, people take us seriously.
Is Putin playing the empire more than a real? Because if you look the international world, you will believe that Russia is a big one because he plays very well the cards. But the economy is not that big, so if comparison with some not a big country, but he, I think, internationally play a great game, showing.
The last few years internationally, he's been pretty clever. Yeah, absolutely. And he doesn't necessarily play by international rules, as we know from the invasion of Crimea. Yeah. Nor does he even believe he has to play by international rules, because he'll say, take your double standards and go away, because you invade countries when you want. So, is that playing empire? I don't know. I mean, it's he sees the defense of Russia's great power status, or real power that it should have, as absolutely essential to his statesmanship, I'm sure. And I think he probably takes some from some ideas of what Russia's role in the world is from the Tsars. Yes. Peter the Great, no doubt, but I think in particular Nicholas I, who was this early 19th century Tsar who ruled by the principles of autocracy, orthodoxy and nationalism, which meant keeping Western ideas out of Russia, building a police state to suppress opposition, and standing up for Russia's interests. Even to the point where Nicholas went to war in Crimea against the whole of Europe to defend what he saw as Russia's interests.
So it's like the idea of Danielewski that Russia is not Europe and Europe hates Russia?
Well, yeah, is he a sort of Slavophile? No, I don't think so. I mean, Eurasian ideas are quite popular in Russia at the moment. Neo-Slavophilism is definitely, around and about everywhere as a sort of discourse. And many people have looked to some neo-Slavophile thinkers as an influence on Putin. But, I don't think Putin has a very clear ideology. I think it's a sort of postmodern mishmash of basic ideas, anything that suits the purposes of the regime and Russia and the rest of it.
Yeah, you see in the discourse, because he says one thing then, and then he says the other thing. So he used what is convenient at the time.
Yeah, I don't think there's a clear ideology. I don't think there's a clear aim. I think definitely he, like Nicholas I, would see himself as the upholder of conservative values. So, it's a very homophobic culture. The regime's very down on LGBT rights. It's very, anti-Western in the sense that it feels it doesn't want to have Western liberal values imposed on it. Yeah, exactly. All the thing about the Eurovision Song Contest and all that, all this stuff is like, he thinks this is signs of Western decadence, depravity, degeneration, and he's going to be the ruler who stands up for sort of religious, family, traditional principles.
And this is why he's so orthodox on the popes.
Yeah, he's supposedly Orthodox, this old KGB guy who's now supposedly devout, has a chapel in the private residence and all this stuff, allegedly. And it's why he's got this macho image, because he's like, a man is a man.
Yeah, but this macho image, he took it from Mussolini.
Exactly, yeah. I mean,
so it's a mix.
It's a mix of stuff, isn't it? Absolutely a mix of stuff. And it's popular. I mean, it works. It works.
It is. Mamushkas with his face.
Yeah, absolutely. It's popular. Yeah. So, he's a clever politician. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. Very clever. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Orlando. That was a great interview, and I hope that helps for people to understand about history from the 20th century Russia, because in another time we can speak about this
Oh, we
history
can
thing.
do that.
Yeah, that would
Big
be
history,
great.
big
Yeah,
country,
big history.
big history.
Okay,
Thank you.